Right now, the two most reliable computer models, the GFS and the European model, are now forecasting that we're going to see a significant tropical storm develop in the main development region. Taking a look at the GFS model's latest run, as we continue to move forward with the forecast, we see that this disturbance will come off the West African coast with plenty of moisture surrounding it, which should allow for the surface, for the air pressure to lower along the surface, for the winds to increase, and of course, we're going to see this potentially develop into a tropical storm as it continues to head further westward, where we do see the pressure continues to drop down to 1,005 millibars by the time we approach Tuesday, June 20th, and moving into the more long-term future. We see this continue to strengthen, potentially weaken just before it moves into the Caribbean, but we do see that beyond that point, we could see this storm re-strengthen once the wind shear dies down and once we see the dry air become limited as it approaches the Caribbean. We do see that this comes uncomfortably close to Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic in the very long-term future. So this is definitely something you need to be concerned about throughout the Caribbean. While it's far from guaranteed you're going to experience any direct impacts from this storm system, it seems like the current consensus from the computer models is that this storm system should come close enough to a point where you will at least experience some impacts, whether it's in the form of rainfall or a strong amount of rip currents or rough surf. There's likely going to be impacts associated with this tropical wave as it continues to head further westward. And worst case scenario is if this storm system does develop as the GFS model is currently forecasting, where we see a 970 millibar hurricane right over the Bahamas, which is very rare for the month of June and even more rare for this storm system to develop in the main development region. But we're seeing it with the GFS and also the European model, where they want to at least develop a tropical storm. The GFS model is more lenient on making this a much more powerful storm, but still, look at the forecast out, we're still very far out. We're going to need to take a look at several different factors that I'm going to show you guys right now that will play a big role in terms of strength and as well as the trajectory of this storm as this continues to head further westward. So how much dry air entrains the storm will be probably the most important factor as the storm system continues to head further westward, because if this storm entrains too much stable air, that'll create a temperature inversion, which would force the surface level air to not rise since it's cooler than the mid-level air mass that's associated with the stable air mass. So as a result, we don't see a lot of convection and latent heat develop since there isn't a lot of water vapor moving upwards into the upper levels of the atmosphere where they could condense and release latent heat. And continuing to move forward, we do see that this tropical wave will maintain its strength and there won't be a lot of dry air ahead of it, as at least that's what the GFS model is currently forecasting. The European model is more confident that there's going to be a higher amount of dry air as the storm moves westward, and it should sort of create a small bubble of moisture where it could sort of fend off a lot of dry air that will be just to the north and west of this storm. However, the dry air could potentially increase as this heads to the Caribbean, but the GFS model, which is very different to what the European model is stating, isn't expecting that much dry air to exist in the Caribbean, which is the reason why the GFS model expects this to eventually rapidly intensify once it moves just north of the Caribbean islands, which will be definitely very concerning if this is the case. The European model's forecast, however, is taking I wouldn't say a completely different scenario. They're both developing this into a tropical storm, but the European model does not expect as significant as a long-term future as the GFS model. And if we were to continue to move forward with the European model forecast, we do see that the European model expects far more dry air, and the reason why is because there's going to be a trough located just to the east of Spain and France that's going to create a strong northwesterly flow that's going to push a lot of the dry air and the Saharan desert air over the main development region. So that should keep the storm a little bit weaker in the European model scenario. However, despite this, the European model also expects at least a decent amount of moisture to surround the storm to protect it from the worst of the dry air, which is the reason why the European model still expects a tropical storm to develop right over this region. And moving forward, we see the pressure stays around at the same level, maybe lowers a little bit by the time it approaches the Caribbean, but we do still see far more dry air than the GFS model is forecasting. So the chance that this develops any more than potentially a weak tropical storm is a lot slimmer in the European model scenario, unless the European model shifts its forecast to bring up more moisture over the Caribbean, which still has yet to be seen. As of right now, it seems like overall, the European model doesn't expect as much instability over pretty much over the northern hemisphere, which will lead to a higher risk of stability, which would inhibit the storm's peak intensity. And we do see that the dry air just becomes too much for this storm to handle. And the reason why the European model expects more dry air to entrain this storm is due to the position of this ridge that's going to be located right over the northeast United States, as well as its low. Since the ridge is a lot further westward, that allows the northwesterly flow to move very close in proximity to where this tropical storm would be by the time we approach Friday, June 23rd. And what this northwesterly flow will do is steer a lot of that cool, stable air that's further northward into Canada, further southward to entrain the storm, and of course, keep it from really intensifying much more than a weak tropical storm. The GFS model, however, expects this ridge to be a lot broader and this ridge to extend a lot further eastward, so we don't see as strong of a northwesterly flow that would push the dry air towards this storm system. Rather, the dry air moves more to the east rather than to the south. So in the GFS model scenario, this storm system is able to avoid the dry air due to the position of this ridge and this low steering that dry air away from this storm. And we do see that continuing to move forward, we see that the northwesterly flow associated from this pressure gradient that's a little bit further westward becomes too much for this storm to handle, as not only it increases the dry air over the center of circulation, but it enhances the wind shear as well. So this storm will have a difficult time to really maintain its strength as it approaches a Caribbean island. So this is definitely something we're going to need to keep in mind, the position of this ridge and this low. Let me show you guys that right now in the 500 millibar height anomaly. So by the time this storm system is pretty much right at the Caribbean island's doorstep, we see that there's going to be this big ridge right over eastern Canada, a small ridge just to the west of this storm system, and a strong low pressure system just south of Greenland. And look at the position of this ridge and this low. This ridge will create while it would create a northwesterly flow, we see that the northwesterly flow doesn't necessarily go far south enough to impact this storm and bring the dry air further southward. We're seeing the dry air and the stronger wind shear as well move more towards the east rather than towards the south to affect this storm. The ridge is a lot broader, which is the reason why the GFS model doesn't expect the dry air to move further southward, but it's a different story when we take a look at the European model. So here's the European model's forecast at the same time period where the storm system is also right at the Caribbean islands doorstep. We see a very big difference. The ridge isn't as broad. We see that the ridge doesn't move as far eastward, and we see that this strong low pressure system just to the south of Greenland is a lot further westward, which would mean that the pressure gradient would force this wind to move further southward, and that would force the dry air to move right over this storm. So the position of this ridge as well as this low will be key in determining if we're going to see this storm intensify any more than a weak tropical storm, or if we'll see this storm completely fizzle out by the time this approaches the Caribbean, thanks to the stronger northerly flow bringing the stronger wind shear as well as more dry air over the storm further southward. So pay close attention to how the ridging will build over the United States over the next week. week or so, because that will be play a major role in terms of the long-term future of this storm. However, I'll say there's a moderate chance right now we're going to see this develop into a tropical storm. The National Hurricane Center is currently giving it a low chance, but the National Hurricane Center is also agreeing that a chance will increase the more long-term we go with the forecast. So I will say a chance is currently moderate. We're just going to need to wait and see how this ridge and this low will build and see how strong the northerly flow will be. Because that will determine if the storm will deal with dry air, which would weaken it, or not deal with it, which would strengthen it. In terms of the overall steering flow that will be over this storm, what's going to be the primary steering flow will be a small Bermuda ridge that's going to be just to the north of it. It's going to be fairly weak, so it won't move necessarily very fast to the west, but it will still move at a gradual pace and eventually towards the Caribbean. And of course, the key that will determine if this storm will make landfall somewhere along the Caribbean islands or not will be how far north or south this ridge will build, which still has yet to be seen. Depends on the amount of troughs that move to the north of it. If the troughs are weaker, then we should expect that the ridge will be a little bit too far northward, and that would force the storm a little bit further northward to potentially avoid the Caribbean islands, which would certainly be good news. However, if the ridge ends up being a little stronger and the troughs end up being a little weaker, that would force the storm further southward. And in fact, if we were to see the strong northerly flow that the European model is forecasting over this storm, the chance will increase that it'll move over the Caribbean islands, but it won't necessarily be as strong because, like I said, the wind shear and the dry air will just be too much for it to handle. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to the position of this ridge as it moves further eastward. Another reason why the GFS model expects a storm to eventually reach hurricane status is because once this storm system passes the longitude of the Caribbean islands further westward, then the GFS model expects the wind shear to be much weaker, because we do see that for the duration of this storm, there's going to be a moderate amount of wind shear, which should limit this storm from, let's say, rapidly intensifying over the main development region. There's going to be an upper level low right over the middle Atlantic, and we also see an upper level high that's going to be just to the south of it that will keep the wind shear rather moderate, but not strong enough to necessarily completely destroy and disorganize the storm. And we do see that there's going to be another upper level high just to the west of this storm system that should bring a stronger northerly upper level wind flow that could inhibit this storm once it approaches the Caribbean. However, we do see once this passes the longitude of let's say Puerto Rico, the upper level, it will move into the area where the upper level high will be right over it, which means the wind shear will be light over the center of circulation, and that would drastically improve the outflow with this storm system for this to rapidly intensify, because a stronger amount of outflow there is associated with a hurricane that pushes a lot of the air in the upper levels away from the center of circulation, which allows more air to rise, which lowers the pressure even more along the surface, which enhances the convection as well as the wind speed along the surface. So that's something we're going to need to pay close attention to, the position of this upper level high. But the European model is expecting a different story regarding the wind shear once this approaches the Caribbean. But moving on to the more long-term future, we do see that the GFS model does bring this close to major hurricane status, but it's very much in the long-term future. So definitely don't take this seriously at all just yet. I'll keep you guys updated if this forecast persists from both of the computer models. Comparing the wind shear forecast to the GFS model, we do see that the European model expects a similar amount of wind shear to exist just to the north of this storm and continuing to move forward. We do see that the wind shear just becomes too much for this storm to handle as it approaches the Caribbean islands, and we see that the same upper level low that was initially bringing wind shear to the GFS model before moving right over the center of circulation, which would limit the amount of wind shear over the eye wall of this storm. We see that same upper level low in the European model's run is a lot further southward towards Central America, so it's experiencing the brunt of the wind shear rather than the weaker portion of the wind shear associated with that upper level high. So we see this storm just fizzle out thanks to the wind shear. So the position of the upper level high will play another big role in terms of whether or not this storm will strengthen into more than a weak tropical storm or not. Here's a broad look at how the water vapor imagery is looking like for the entirety of the northern Atlantic. We do see that it is a storm system we're watching, and I wouldn't say there's going to be a good possibility this will develop into a tropical storm until any time, I'll say, beyond the 4-day mark, once this is right in the middle of the main development region a little bit further westward. Once this storm really organizes itself and moves over water that's warmer than the 80-degree threshold, and so that's when you should expect the highest risk of this developing into Tropical Storm Bret. And here are what the ensemble members are stating at this point, and we do see that much of the ensemble members do want to strengthen this into a tropical storm in the more long-term future, beyond, I'll say, the 5-day point, where we do see that most of GFS ensemble members do agree that this will develop into a tropical storm. So I do expect National Hurricane Center to eventually increase its forecast regarding the chance this will develop, and this could come uncomfortably close to the Caribbean islands. So this is definitely something we're going to need to pay close attention to. Here's the current chance the National Hurricane Center is giving this of developing. 0% chance within the next 48 hours, which makes sense, but it increases once over the next 7 days to up to a 30% chance. So this is definitely something you guys are definitely going to need to pay close attention to, and could go straight towards the Caribbean. So this is my forecast regarding the potential of Tropical Storm Bret. I do think that we have a moderate chance of this developing into a tropical storm, and in the more long-term future, if the GFS model ends up being more correct and we see a weaker northerly flow that would steer the dry air away from the storm, I do expect that a hurricane would be more likely in the more long-term future, but it's still far from certain. So I'll keep you guys updated, but a moderate chance of a tropical storm should be expected, and the Caribbean islands need to keep an eye on this. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.